Okay, we're going to talk about implicit and explicit intents. So intents are a way of running another activity, and another activity is basically another app or another screen that you can create. Remember, we have a main activity, which is our main screen we work with. If we want to create another basic screen, we call that an activity. We create activity code and an activity layout for that. If we're going to run our own one, we have to be explicit about saying we're going to run this particular activity. But if we're running another app, like say we want a picture taken, we can run an implicit intent where we just imply that we want to get a picture taken, and Android will actually take care of some of the other stuff. So we're going to look at a couple of these things. Let's first look at this link to Google Training, talking about interacting with other apps, and that's what these intents are for, particularly specifically the implicit activity or intents here. So there's a couple lessons. Here's how to send a user to another app here, and this just walks you through building an implicit intent. We create what is called a URI, which is similar. You may be familiar with URLs, which are these addresses up here for websites. But that's very specific to the HTTP protocol. URI is a more general description of this sort of stuff, and it can have multiple different formulations for lots of different content. So, for example, here's rather than HTTP intent. This is a telephone one, so it starts with TEL and then a colon and the phone number to call here. This is actually a string, so we have to convert that into a URL object. So we use this URI dot parse and then specify the string we want converted to a URI. We keep that as the phone number, and then we create an intent. And there's a number of different actions here that we can do, and one of them is dial, and we can specify a number or the URI that we're going to use to dial that number. So this is the code for setting up an intent, and then we just have to say start activity and give it this intent, and it will send this to the Android system and to dial the phone, and hopefully there's some app on your tablet or phone that can dial here. So that's the idea, is you don't have to build an app to do that. You can use one of the other apps for that. Similarly, here's an intent for mapping. So again, we're building another URI with a different meaning here or prefix here. And again, we might specify it one way. Here's we're specifying latitude and longitude, so there's different ways of specifying this. And then we're creating a new intent, and here the action is action view. Now here it seems obvious that this should go to a telephone because it's action dial, but a lot of our intents will be action view, and there's just a handful of intent actions out here that we'll see. And so Android actually uses the URI and what's in the URI to tell what app. So it's going to see a geolocation here and say, oh, that should be a map to view something, and it'll send this to a map intent. So it's a combination of this intent action type and then the type of the URI that you're sending to determine what type of intent to run. Similarly, like here's a web page, and again, here's a typical URL, which is also a subclass of URI, so HTTPS here, and we're creating it. And again, this action is action view, which is the same as this one, but again, this the URI will have a different prefix here. So rather than geo, it'll be HTTPS, and it'll see HTTPS view action, and it'll say, oh, that needs to go to a web viewer, and it'll run a web viewer for you. So sometimes we can specify some information in the URI here, like the web address, but there are times where we want additional information. For example, if we're sending out an email address, our action is action send rather than action view, and we create a URI here for that. But actually, we don't create a URI for email because there isn't a good one for that. So what they do is they just have a generic intent, but we put a whole bunch of extras in this intent. So once we have our intent defined, we can say that intent.put extras, and we can store information in that intent. It's always with some sort of key and then some value. Key value pair is how we store these things in here. So here, this lets us specify like the subject line of the message, maybe even the message itself, and who it's going to, and things like that for it. So you'll gain some experience later on. We'll do this for calendar and map activities, and like for calendars, you'll be able to specify it. Like here's a calendar activity. So again, here's our intent here. So we're creating an insert action to insert something in the calendar, and then there's just a generic URI here that we're using for a calendar. But now we're actually going to, once we have our intent, we're going to put some extra stuff in here, like the title of the calendar activity, the location maybe, and then maybe the begin and end time. Though begin and end time has to be a special format here, so we actually are converting the current times to a certain format for this, and setting that up. And we'll look at some other ways of doing that in the example this week. So. Okay, so that's how we do it. And again, once we have our intent created, we just say start activity and pass and set it the intent. So this variable has to be the variable we create. So in this case, it would be after all this stuff, we'd say start activity and we'd say, what is it called? Calendar intent. Or up here, when we did this web intent, we'd say start activity parenthesis web intent. So that this is always the variable that we define for our intent. And that'll run our other app for that here. Okay, let's go back here, and we're going to talk a little bit later about getting results from activity, but for implicit activities, there are ways of getting results like a photo back from a camera or stuff like that. You set that up, and so we'll talk about how to set up this listener for this, and this gets a little more complicated to do. Now let's look at this other one, just overview of intents and intents filters here. So again, talk about each of these apps is another activity we're running in another app or in our same app for explicit intents here. Now there's also something called a service, which is like kind of a background activity that's running, not attached to an app necessarily, but we're not going to worry about that or broadcast here. So again, it talks about explicit intents where we're running our own specific class, or implicit intents where we're just setting some background, some activity. So again, this shows here, let's open up this image, look at this a little bit more. So we might be in this activity, we will say start activity and we'll give it an intent. That'll go to the Android system. The Android system will parse that intent, look at the type of action and then the URI or other information about it, and then decide and create a filter of what other kind of activities can use that. It may find, just one activity that can dial the phone or one calendar activity, and it'll send it to that. If it has multiple, it'll often pop up a little screen saying, there are two ways of viewing web pages. Which one do you want? Do you want to always use this one or just use this Chrome or Safari this one time here? So that's all taken by the Android system. Once the Android system determines what activity to send it to, it calls onCreate for that activity and sends some of the intent data to that activity as part of the onCreate process. And when this activity is done, we return back to our first activity for us. So that's the general layout of these activities. And again, they talk about building the names of activities, the actions, different kinds of actions, action view, action send here, and then again, how to push some data in here and how to store some extra data in here. And then we'll get to explicit intents in a little bit in the next section. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is common intents. This is a really nice page that just lists examples of lots of common intents. So over here is a whole list of common intents. So like if we want to initiate a phone call, we go down here, talks about the phone call, what the action is, and talks about the different data you can specify here, different formats, and then gives an example of setting it up. This puts it in a special little method where we're passing in a string. So we're passing a string for the phone number. It's creating the intent here, action dial. Then it's creating the URI here for this. It's adding the TEL to the phone number and creating that and adding that URI to the data for our intent here, and then we're actually going to start the activity. But in this case, it's going to check maybe there's not an app out there that can dial a phone. Maybe you're on a tablet and you don't have any phone apps on your tablet or something like that. So it is going to do this intent resolve activity and check if there's something that can actually run this intent. So if, as long as there is that it's not null, then it's going to start up the intent here. The other way is sometimes you'll see these places just start up the intent and it maybe catch an error. Try and catch an error when you do start activity, and then if it doesn't back, you just maybe pop up a message saying no apps found to do your intent. So again, they're all set up this way, and then on the right you can look at all these. So if we want to set up send a text message, this talks all about it, and then here we can see it in Java is how we set up the text message stuff, and we're passing in the actual message here, and then if we have an attachment, we're passing that in. So again, you can look at how do you play music, how do you show something on a map, how do you send an email, how do you add people to your contacts, how do you capture an image on your camera, how do you add something to your calendar. So they have all these different examples here set up, and they're all in their own little methods here. They pass in the data you're going to need for that intent. They set up, and they always in the end they'll check if there's an intent available and start that activity. Okay, so that's an overview of implicit intents.